Thank you all. So first of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here. So thanks to Felipe and all the guys that are helping this event. What I'm talking about is what I believe it's going to be a new era on the financial markets, the secure tokens era. So I think that I've worked in the financial market for more than 20 years. So I left a big bank. I worked for Rabobank in Brazil. I was a director of Rabobank Brazil a few years ago. And I left to start a fintech, and I entered on this blockchain crypto market. And I'm gonna pass through this, what I've seen and what I expect to see in the coming years. So the globalization or the dematerialization of the financial markets, it's a thing that's happening for a long time. So it's not for now that we don't use. Do you have a? Oh, we had certificate of deposit. So I think that few of the people here have seen that, right? It used to be common like 20, 30 years ago. Shares, company shares. So we don't use that anymore. It's all digital. Credit cards, money. So I've done a test myself not to use money for 2 months in Brazil, and it was completely okay. I could use just credit cards and all the apps or cell phone to pay the things. So for small tickets, sometimes it's still an issue, right? If you're gonna pay that, say, something close to €1, €1.50, it's difficult for people to accept the credit cards because there's a large tax or the companies charge a lot for that. But for most of the things, you don't use money anymore, right? And we still have, for global payments, what you call SWIFTs. So for all the global payments in the world, SWIFT is the major way for the banks to exchange euros to dollars to real to whatever currency you have in mind, right? A lot of intermediaries, but we are seeing a world which is not linear anymore, right? So I think that's the thing that Singularity University did a really good work on that, teaching everyone that everything now it's exponential. It starts very slow, and that suddenly it explodes. And that's what I think it's going to happen here. But let's start with the beginning. Bitcoin. I think that most of the people here started listening about blockchain with these guys here, or this guy, Satoshi, or whatever group they are, right? They issued a white paper 10 years ago. And on the white paper, who have read that? I think that most of the guys have read that, but I think that's really important for us to read it, right? That's a small paper, 9 pages, easy. I'm not from technology, I'm from banking. I can understand that. I don't code, but and on the summary it says, oops, without going through a financial institution. At the beginning he says, I'm doing a currency that people can exchange one to another without an intermediary. And that's the creation of what we're gonna call blockchain or DOT now, right? No intermediaries, blocks that are linked one to another with cryptography, right? And that's the thing that he could exchange money through the internet, Bitcoin, right? It's not a new thing. Most of the protocol is based on email information, so it's normal for us to send an email from one to another. But the issue about email is that when you send an email, you still have the email on your box, right? You can send to 5 people the same email. That worked with email, right? But with money, it cannot be possible. It creates what we call the double spending problem. So what Satoshi or the group solved is that with these blocks, he could solve that. And if I send this email or Bitcoin from me to another person, this email is not with me anymore. So I cannot send that twice, and that solved the double spending problem, right? It's more technical than that, of course, but that's the way it happened. What is blockchain? Blockchain at the end, it's a database, it's a distributed database. It's a database, right? If you don't want to store anything, or you don't need a database, you don't need blockchain. So that's a thing that needs to be clear for everyone. It's not all, blockchain doesn't solve all the things, right? There's a hype about blockchain nowadays, that blockchain will solve all the things on Earth, and that's not the case, but it helps a lot on a lot of things that we have nowadays, right? Some characteristics of blockchain. So it's immutable data. If you put a thing in blockchain, you cannot change anymore. It can be with no central counterparty, right? There's a distinction that I don't do here between blockchain and DLT, right? DLT are the distributed ledger technology, which can be centralized. Most of the time it's centralized. That's R3, that's Hyperledger, and all these initiatives. When they're talking about blockchains, most of the time it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all these cryptocurrencies that are distributed in any place. There's a lot of transparency. It can prevent frauds. There's a low administration cost, and so on. Those three for me are the most important ones. Right? It's transferable, it's immutable, and it has no central counterparty. Those are the three elements that will change the financial market, in my view. ICO. ICO was a hype last year, but it started some long ago. So we had one of the first one was the Ethereum ICO, more than 4 years ago. Then we had the IOTA and others in 2015, and started to get traction in 16. So, but it was still very small, $95 million in 1 year. When we entered the 17, it exploded, $6 billion in 1 year, most of them in the second half of the year. And then 18, we are already at $21 billion issued of ICO. Of course, ICO has a big issue that the panel was really well discussed here. What's the difference between utility token and security token? Here we have everything, right? So, and it created a lot of problems for people that invested, for the regulators, and for everyone, right? A lot of frauds involved on this. Maybe the last one is maybe this one. Who have received that here in the last month? That was really crazy, right? I've received it from a lot of sources, right? I don't, to be honest, I don't know if it's a scam or not, but the way it's sold, it's like a scam, right? It's promising a lot. You don't need to invest money. They want just your data, put your email, your name, and all these things. So I didn't do that, but there's a lot of friends of mine, and probably friends of yours that were on that, right? It's still there. There's probably 2 months ago, right? It didn't end. I think that they work with a lot of, there's a lot of work on how the humans behave, right? And they really know how to use that, right? All the guys that issue all these scans, they know how to get the people and to invest in these pyramids or scams. So a lot of money was spent on that. And the question is there a way to issue an ICO using blockchain technology that really is it complies with all the regulations that we have now? It should have, right? So all the investors need to invest on a good way, right? With no big risks, right? We need the rewards, but we don't want to assume big risks. And the way that regulators look at that the regulators need to help the investors on that. That's the way I see it, right? So we have both things on the same side. But But before that, how the regulators see this blockchain or RCO initiatives? The first thing is that most of them, and well, I would say all that I know, all the regulators that I know, they divide that in two things: the utility tokens and the security tokens. Okay, the utility tokens, like mileage plan, or a lot of examples like that. That's not a security. Don't promise to pay dividends. You just invest in this token that's going to be used on this ecosystem, and just that. That's a utility. It's not easy to for the regulators to tell whether it's a security or a utility token. Security is all the things that we use for investment. It's a bond, it's a derivative, it's a real estate asset, it's a fund, it's everything, right? But as this technology is new and there's a lot of ideas around it, it's not easy for the regulators to find whether it's a utility token or a security token. That's the first thing. But let's say that we want to issue a security token. Those are more or less the difference between both, right? So when we're talking about security tokens, it's regulated. It's regulated in any country in the world, right? All the it's CVM in Brazil, it's CMVM here, it's a SEC in the SAC in the US. Every country has its own regulator, but in the end, it's all regulator, and it's for investment, right? Initial coin offer can be these things here, and I agree with the panel here that in 2017 most of the ICOs were really STOs and not ICOs, right? But this terminology, secure token offer, first time that I've listened to that was this year. I don't know about you guys, but STO is just thing that started this year. This terminology is really quite new. So and it's not different than an ICO that is regulated. If you take from the ICOs that were issued last year. Regulators. It's a problem for all the regulators around the world, right? All the regulators have their legislation. Most of them use the whole rate test to qualify whether it's a security or a utility token, right? But they are taking different views on that. I can take just for two guys that I more or less know. So the US allows it for accredited investors. Accredited investors are investors that have more than $1 million or earns more than $200,000 a year. So big investor. Brazil, security tokens are not allowed. I think that's the same here in Portugal as well. CVM in Brazil doesn't allow security tokens to be issued in Brazil. And they have another issue there. Even if they could be issued, they would have a problem in terms of trades, right? Because the trade of securities in Brazil, and most of the countries are like that, needs to be through a regulated exchange, right? And a regulated exchange for crypto, it's a thing that's just few countries. US has in some, not all the country, but in some states they have regulations or stamp for that. But in Brazil we don't have that. In Europe I don't see that anymore. I still don't see that. Good thing here for me is that I love competition. And this is a competition between countries to help these companies to issue that. The panel here was clear that Switzerland, Malta, US, Portugal, right? They are really competing for this money, because this in the end it's going to be a more globalized world. If we issue an STO in Switzerland or in Brazil or in Portugal, what's the difference, right? You are issuing a thing there that can be traded all around the world. If there's an exchange that lists that in Asia, for example, right? So it's a big deal for the regulators here and for the countries going forward. Some initiatives that I've seen so far. So 4 types of securities, right? real estate, shares, bonds, and commodities. Real estate, there's a initiative in Germany that's tokenization of rates, real estate funds. So most of the STOs that I've seen so far are tokenization of funds, because funds, in the end, it's a legal instrument that's already tokenized, right? The shares of the fund are a token. It's very similar, right? So that's easy to kind of adjust the regulation to issue that, right? So we just get the shares of the fund and express that as a token, right? You have a lot of difficult to match that, the amount of tokens that you have with the amount of asset or the value of the asset that you have in the fund, but it's nothing different than adjusting for an ETF. ETF does the same thing, right? ETF is a fund that's traded as a token in an exchange, right? But that's just one. I've seen some others like that. When we go to bonds, we have the first one, or maybe it's not the first one. There was one issued by a bank here in Europe as well. But the World Bank issued a blockchain bonds last September, like 2 months ago. It's just starting, right? But there are some big guys trying to do that. That's an article that I've written for Brazil. Funds, another one, BR11. So that's an offer summer. It's went live some weeks ago. It's a Brazilian fund that invests in a lot of startups. So they put all the startup shares in one fund and tokenized this fund with these startups. So it's a fund itself. Shares, stock shares, not found yet. I didn't see any initiative that's tokenized or a secured, an STO that's worked like a stock share, because it needs to pay dividends. It needs to have the governance, right, and all the things that the regulator asks them to have. Maybe more deep, we're gonna need more time to have that, but for me it's a matter of time. Why I think that it's gonna grow exponentially? I think that those are the main things that in my view, STOs or security tokens are here to stay. So divisibility, it's easy to track the transaction. It has a global market access. Liquidity, it's an issue still. So I don't think that the liquidity is going to be created as a matter of fact. So it needs to be work on that. You're going to have a lot of exchange trading the securities tokens, and that's an issue in the beginning. Costs for the initial offer is much lower than IPO or venture capital costs or things like that. Negotiation can be decentralized, and it's fungible, so we can sum add or subtract the amount of tokens that you have very easily. What's the size of the security tokens? What's the size of the security market globally? It's huge. So we are talking about a thing that it has just in the West $228 trillion in real estate, right? But we're talking about a little bit more than that now, $8 trillion in equities, $100 trillion in securitized debt. So it's a huge market, and it's concentrated in a lot of intermediaries around the world, mostly banks, right? Banks and big exchanges. So stock market, equities, stock exchange. We have like 5 in the world that dominates that, right? Real estate, here's more divided, it's on individuals, but there's a lot of funds and banks also that invest in that, or at least have mortgage that's attached to that. Debts, the companies, and most of these debts are in banks, right? It's really concentrated. And that's one of the reasons why I think that is going to be disrupted, right? There's a lot of concentration here, with a technology that it's by definition decentralized. It's here to have less intermediaries, right? Who have started to surf this wave? Some guys here, I just selected 3 of them: Securitize, T0, and Polymath. They are trying to, they are using the engine or the technology they have to help people or help companies that want to securitize or to tokenize this the securities that they have, right? They also working on having exchange or way to trade this security, because it doesn't. One of the good things about security is that it needs to be tradable, right? You don't want to issue a security and just book that in your books and let them there. And there are some others that are working. Sometimes are the same, sometimes are others that are working on how to get liquidity to this this market, right? As you can see here, it's just that was from July this year, right? It's just little ones that are some ones that are really up and running, but it's still they're still working on that. It's still project. So this is a technology or thing that's not happening yet. We are just starting this development. There's a lot of things that needs to be done in order for us to have that. But we are talking about a lot of others here. Like we have Coinbase, we have Nasdaq, we have a lot of other companies working on that as well, right? Challenge. For me, the first challenge as a non-tech guy is this one here. How to make sure that A equals B. I mean, how to make sure that this token equals this fund, this real estate, this debit, this thing that it's really a security today, right? That's the issue. How you link that, right? Of course, for assets that are physical, like real estate, I think that's more difficult to link, right? Because the regulation and all the legislation, it's more difficult. But there are some assets that are already digital at the beginning, like money, for example, right? If you're thinking about stable coins, as you say, let's say the central banks issuing money using tokens or blockchain, that's a thing that for me it's a matter of days or months to happen, right? Because it's an asset that's already digital, right? But for securities, most of it, or at least half of it, as we saw in this chart, global chart with all the volumes that we have, are related to real estate. Real estate is physical, right? How do we digitalize this physical asset and make sure that it's attached one to another? So that's for me the big challenge here. Second one is the custody of the tokens. Who's gonna have the custody of it? So for Bitcoin, it's us, right? It's not an intermediary, but there's a lot of stories about losing the private key and all those things. We are not used to this kind of thing, right? We're probably gonna need some intermediary or some way to help us on that, right? A wallet or whatever, right? But I think that solution needs to come still. Know your customers, it's a big issue here. Security, of course, taxes and all those things that are related to the security. How the regulator needs to know who is the owner of this security that's issued in Malta, in Brazil, or whatever, right? And if it's a guy that's in the US, needs to pay tax in the US. If it's a guy that has a fiscal position, or it's based in Europe, he needs to pay tax here. So that's I think that's it's one challenge. And also this thing here that I consider it's a lot of local legislation dealing with a global asset. When you issue a token, it's there, it's on the internet. In theory, you can trade that in any place in the world. But at the same time, you have different regulations in each local that you're going to trade at. That's a big issue for the regulators. That's going to give the lawyers a lot of work in the coming years, in my view. So this thing about the lawyers will be smashed by smart contracts and this thing, forget about that. They'll have a lot of work to deal with these global assets and local legislation. So just to sum up before let's say some questions, I think that it has a lot of room to grow. It's a thing that's just starting. Its function, characteristics, and will facilitate access, diminish costs, and eliminate intermediaries. There are still major challenges on that, as we saw. But when there's a trillion market to be solved or to be helped, solution is found, right? That's my view on that. Thank you. Questions? That's the best part. And we can get in contact by LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest way for us to get in contact. Email and things change a lot.
Perfect. Well, thanks for the presentation. Just as you were going, I kept thinking about just because we tokenize it, it doesn't necessarily change the value. Do you fear that just like we saw with the ICO craze or the crypto craze, where just because you put the word crypto or you put the word tokenized security, it could potentially cause a inflation or a overvaluation? And if that was to happen, with the trillions of dollars of real estate that we're talking about, just using real estate as an example,
we're going to have more inflation.
What could that cause to the economy?
I think that's the hype that we saw last year about saying about even Kodak, right? Kodak is a classical case for disruption, right? It invented the digital camera and it was bankrupted some years after that. Even Kodak was saying that we have a project in blockchain or in crypto. Now we are talking a more regulated environment. The STOs, or the security tokens, are in a regulated environment. That's why I think that the hype cannot be that big. Of course, if you're a company and you are dealing with that or using that, that means that you are in the edge of the technology nowadays, which is quite good. Maybe the investors can see and say, "Oh, this guy is going for the right direction," and overprice that a little bit. But as you go to a lot of assets or a lot of companies doing that, the hype just goes down, right? I think that's a matter of time for it. I think that if I understand that correct, your question are more directing me to say, oh, we can have more inflation on the assets, right? Because if the assets are valued more, the inflation goes up. Artificially, yes. My view on that is that we are already on the now it's economics, right? It doesn't have anything to do with STO. But the governments issued a lot of money the last 10 years, right? Because of the crisis. So, but the assets are still the same, right? So we have this amount of money and this amount of assets. There's an imbalance. It's not balanced anymore, right? Let's say that it was balanced, let's say 10 years or 11 years ago. That's already a big issue, right? There are ways to solve that. One of the ways is to inflate that, inflation. The other way is to cut this thing. So it's less money, maybe some issues in the economic growth and these things. But that's an adjustment that is going to take place in the coming years, in my view. But that's nothing that doesn't have anything to do with security token. Okay.
Hi, great talk. When do you expect to see this first wave of security token offerings to come through? And do you think that this will open the door to the real institutional money and to more official, let's say, position from these larger banks, hedge funds, and so on?
Yeah. So the first thing, what's the big issue about the security tokens? The link between A and B, right? The ASIN thing. So that, in my view, it needs someone that's that we can trust to tell me that A equals B. It can be a bank, it can be an exchange, but it needs to be someone that we know. It also can be Google, right? The good thing about that, it doesn't need to be a financial institution. We need someone, and I've seen some example of some big guys working on that. And I think that some of them are banks, some of them are technology companies. As soon as they put that together and say, guys, A equals B, you can trade A, that I guarantee that it's the same as B. If they do that, that's for me the beginning of the thing. It's just one of the big guys putting their credibility on that. And I think that's not far from here. I would guess it's difficult to do some predictions on that, but I would say it's probably next year, somewhere next year, right? And your second question?
Do you think that this will open the doors to the real institutional money, so more official stance from banks, from hedge funds, and so on?
Of course, of course. Because here you are not talking about a different thing like cryptocurrency. We are talking about things that they already trade. It's a security, but it's traded in another way now, not through intermediaries, right? So that's just a matter of adjust that, and regulation let them do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask you, at the end of the day, what would be the biggest difference between an IPO and an STO? And how would be the big players, like the bankings, who are like the intermediaries between the issuer and the investor, if they'd be happy at all of losing a big chunk of the market that they currently have? Thank you.
They're not going to be happy for sure, right? So that's why they are some of them are working on that, right? There are the banks that are the main banks that does IPOs. They are, of course, looking at it and trying to cope with this new technology. The big difference for me, it's first of all in terms of costs, right? So an ICO, it's an STO, it's much more easy to do in terms of all the costs. It involves much less intermediaries than the IPO, right? IPO, you need to list in an exchange, right? You need to get one bank as the leader. You have a lot of other banks that will have on the same thing. You have to have a custody guy. You have to have a law firm to have a lot of things, right? Of course, most of it is related to regulation, right? So if the regulations go on the way to say apply that to an STO, it's not going to be that cheap anymore. But maybe we have now, the way I see it, we have now a room to make it better, right? Because there's a lot of regulation here that is still not necessary in the environment that we are now, right? So the regulations probably we're gonna help on that. That's the way I see it.
It's the last question, okay?
Okay.
It's just because we are.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Gustav, great talk. I just wanted to ask your view. You mentioned a couple of projects that are already trying to implement security tokens, but you said at the same time that local legislation is different. So depending on the country, you have a different legislation. How do you see that it is possible in the near future that all the legislation is compliant and is not, how do you say, unfavorable in some countries and then favorable in other countries?
Yeah, that's.
Thank you.
But I think that's the thing here is it's about competition, right? So the countries are competing one to another to have this market, and it's going to be a big market in the future, right? I think that's as it becomes clear that the ones that are doing the right thing or the best thing are growing more or are attracting more talents, attracting more people, all the other ones will go on the same thing, right? Of course, there's some small ones that are taking more risk now to have this leadership, and the big ones will probably be more slow on that. But I think that they will come. Eventually, they will come, because otherwise, all the talents, all the good people, all the good projects, all the money, all the big companies in the future will be just in this small country, and that's not the way I see it. I think that as they see this trend, they will have, and we're probably gonna see in the future global legislation that it's more aligned. It's not gonna be 100% aligned for sure, but a more aligned one, because here we are talking about a global thing. So last year from Brazil, I invested in a startup in China. Just bought a token of an ICO in China. I was in Brazil. So 10 years ago, I would never know about this ICO, about this startup in China that was needing money for a project. So the way to invest in startups 10 years ago, either you did that through a venture capital, or you went to Silicon Valley, in some place in the world, to know the guy there and, oh, this guy has a good idea, let me invest in that. I mean, nowadays it's global. We can have access to the big projects in any place that you are. So that's why I think that the regulation needs to be vertical in all the world. It's not going to be like that, but that's the way I see it should come there. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. A company that has made an ICO as a stock shares? No. Those ones here are STOs. The one from Germany, Blickblock. This one is a real estate STO, right? I think that they'll have this presentation, right? I sent them to the PDF.
If you allow, yes. The thing is,
also, this it's bonds, STO bonds issued by the World Bank in Australia. For sure there isn't. Still, I haven't seen it. Probably there are some, but not that I've seen. But funds, there's this Brazilian fund as well. Right? There are some projects, and it pops up every week, right? But just these three examples are examples of securities. Okay.
Well, thank you, Gustavo. Well, give it up for Gustavo.
Thank you very much.